Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GovInvest monthly webinar series. Today's webinar is titled, Why Cities Need to Change to Grow. And I have the privilege of interviewing Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, who is the architect of the 10-year financial plan for the City of Baltimore. But first, a few housekeeping items. Our next webinar will be October 21st, 2021 at 11 a.m. Pacific. And the topic for our next webinar is a good one. What makes a great chief financial officer or local government CFO? Now, as far as this webinar is concerned, we will send out a recording as well as a copy of the slide deck after the conclusion of the webinar. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature of the Zoom link to address questions as we walk through the slide deck. We want this to be participatory. In fact, Mayor Stephanie and I will be chatting back and forth, and we want you to join in that conversation. So please use the question and answers, use the chat function. And of course, if you have any questions after the webinar is over, you can always address those questions to Christian@govinvest.com, and we'll be including that email address again at the end of this presentation. So I'm Charlie Francis, and I'll be your webinar moderator today. And I'm a retired city finance director with over 45 years of government finance experience. I'm now a senior consultant with GovInvest. And oh, by the way, the city I retired from recently brought me back to on an interim basis while they're searching for a new finance director. So not only am I a retired finance director, but I'm a colleague again. So it's nice to be back with all my other colleagues at GFOA, finance directors, city managers, et cetera. So I'm just honored to be here today with Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake. She was the 49th mayor of Baltimore from 2010 to 2016. And so Mayor, please tell us about yourself and especially what inspired you to be a public servant.
Charlie, it is good to be with you. When I hear you tell your story about retirement and now being reactivated, it's, you know what they say, it's like, I tried to get out, but they pulled me back in.
Exactly right.
But it is, when you are a person who's really dedicated to public service, there is no getting out. You always find a way to continue to serve. So I'm happy to be here with you and the others who are on the call. What got me into did you say public service or interested in long-term financial planning?
First public service and then long-term financial planning, yes.
Public service, it's a long story and a short story. The long is, I was raised by people who believed in the power of education and service. My father was a math professor and a public servant. At the time of his passing, almost 18 years ago, he was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee for our state legislature and spent a significant amount of his time mastering the budget for the state of Maryland, trying to get the most that he could, not just for the city of Baltimore, but for challenged communities all over the state. And he was a force to be reckoned with and really set a strong example for me about the importance of fiscal management when it comes to using public funds. And I knew that I wanted to be an elected official, a public servant, since I was in elementary school. So, SGA, Young Democrats, to law school, to the city council. I ran for city council right out of law school, became the youngest person ever in Baltimore City. And, it's like, I stuck with it and I moved from city council member to vice president to president to mayor to president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, of the first and only Black woman to serve as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And I was asked by President Obama's political team during his second term to be the secretary for the DNC.
Wow, fantastic! What a background! I'm really looking forward to exploring this topic with you today and learning more about your experiences. James Baldwin, a famous American novelist, playwright, essayist, poet, and activist, once quoted, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Mayor Rawlings-Blake, you saw fiscal challenges facing the city of Baltimore. Tell us about them and when you became mayor. or even before you became mayor?
Charlie, you have quoted my absolute favorite author. So I think this is totally fitting. And it is really how I defined my time in public office, facing what needed to be faced. When I first started on the city council, I remember being encouraged to spend some time really learning the budget, not just by my father, but from older, more experienced elected officials. And I did. I spent time with our budget director. I really paid attention during the budget season in the city council, and year after year, whether we had a budget that had a surplus and people were fighting, it felt like fighting over scraps, or whether we had a deficit and we were trying to figure out, where we could pinch pennies, no matter what year, highs or lows, the budget team was all, and the finance team was always talking about the fact that Baltimore City had a structural budget deficit. And it puzzled me that year after year, the finance team was sounding an alarm, and it seemed to be falling on deaf ears. And when I became mayor in 2010, we're coming out of the, we were still in the midst of recovering from the housing bubble, and the bill became due for so many of the things that we had been challenged. Our pension system was severely underfunded, and alarm bells were going off there. We faced a significant operations budget deficit in my first year, and to me, I'd spent too much time in government not to act when I was in the position to do something about it. So when I was mayor, I felt very strongly that the problems that were facing us, we had to face, and I had to face. And I made it my mission to set the city on the right course for the fiscal. I wanted to leave the city in a better fiscal position than I found it.
Well, that's wonderful. Many local governments were facing the similar fiscal challenges, and then COVID hit, and those fiscal challenges have become even worse for many local governments. And even with the American Rescue Plan Act, the money from that, the future still seems pretty uncertain. So all of these challenges.
I want to interrupt you right there and to say that the best thing you can do to prepare your city for the potential of a downturn is to get its finances in order. And Baltimore, we were one of the things that was noted during the pandemic was the fact that the decisions that we had made previously helped us weather this storm. And I think we all know another storm is coming. You don't know what it's going to be, but if you stay in government long enough, you're going to face a significant challenge. The best position is to do your work ahead of time and not have to try to scramble when you're facing that crisis to try to right the ship.
Well, I just love that. We just wish more and more local government elected and appointed officials. We're preparing today for tomorrow's realities. The structural imbalance is a plague that's affecting many of our local governments. But you put together a leadership team that included staff members and outside consultants. Tell us about that team you assembled.
So yeah, definitely. Inside of city government, I had my finance director, my budget director, my chief of staff, and also my policy and communications person. And each person played a significant role. And I guess it might be, counterintuitive to think that my communications person was the policy and communications person was at the table to talk about financial planning. But for me, it's not just about what we did, but it was about communicating the what and the why to the people that we serve. Because in order to in order to make these changes, we had to do some very unpopular things. But when you're able to talk with credibility about the reasons why, we were able to do some things that people didn't think would be possible and have some really significant gains because of that. One of them is the $1 billion in school construction. We were able to bring to the city of Baltimore, financed by a tax on, it was a beverage tax. And it was one of, nobody wants, I don't think any elected official wants to talk about raising taxes, but because we were in communication with our constituents, they understood that one of the things that we were trying to do was to solve this problem of having the oldest schools in the state and having facilities that were, that our children deserved better. And we had to figure out a way to pay for them. So again, this was a tax, but it was a tax that our constituents wanted to be a part of. They said, if we'll pay a quarter more on a Coke if it means our kids can have better places to go to school. And so, every time I pass a new school building, my heart is warm because I know that, we fought very hard against some very strong lobbyists, but it was worth it because we were doing the right thing for our young people.
Well, I read in the report that not only was your finance department and Bureau of Budget Management, not only were they involved in the technical input for the long-term financial plan, but the plan was also informed by guidance committees. Tell us about these guidance committees. How were they formed? Did they include city council members? Did your city council members support you in this preparing this document? Not the outcome, in preparing that document. Yeah.
In preparing the document, I don't remember the council members having an input in preparing the document, but I believe in inclusivity when it comes to making change. And we had participation all along the way. You can't have, it's hard to have buy-in, when they're just seeing the product and they haven't seen, how it was made, especially when you're trying to do something as significant as but this, a 10-year financial plan. So we look for stakeholders. I'm pretty sure, if my memory serves me correctly, not just from inside of government, but from the community as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I guess through these efforts, through these, all of this extensive data gathering, a 100+ page report was prepared. It detailed the fiscal challenges and some of the options. How was that report received by the media, by your city council, and by your citizens?
It was all things considered, it was, I think, warmly received in the sense that, no one could fault my administration for trying to identify what was a significant vulnerability for the city. Now, were there some eyebrows raised with some of the solutions? Yes, because some of the solutions that were suggested in the document were changes to the way that things had been done in the city, for generations. So there was there was some push and some pull, but overall, because we were confronting I think it was the thing everyone knew was there. There's the elephant in the corner. We were confronting it. No one could fault us for really taking a stab at this very challenging problem.
Yeah. I saw that they very methodically prepared the long-term financial report, your team and your leadership. It started with a baseline analysis of the city's finances, on a carry forward basis over the next 10 years, with current programs and current policies, estimate of economic conditions, you prepared this baseline, and then your team developed detailed multi-year budget models that applied assumptions about future growth and to to thousands and thousands of your general fund line items. I encourage our audience to read that report because it lays out a nice methodology for preparing a 10-year financial plan. And at the next half of this webinar, I'll summarize that methodology for everyone. But really, the base problem was that the baseline revenues, the recurring baseline revenues, could not keep pace with recurring service expenditures. What was the magnitude of the structural deficit? Do you recall, like in dollar amounts, when
About
how large that was?
I think it was about $700 or $750 million.
Oh my goodness! And I saw also in there that one of the three core principles that you were applying for reform was retiree medical care costs. So I guess you did work in pension and retiree medical benefits into that forecast, didn't you?
Yeah, we had to, talk about the bills becoming due. When we took a look at the almost exponential growth year to year of our health costs, we realized that we had to do a better job of controlling our costs. And one of the things that we knew initially we needed to do was an audit, a healthcare audit. And even if a city undertakes a healthcare audit, we saved millions of dollars just by, booting, I shouldn't say booting people off, but eliminating coverage that people that were unqualified. So we had, whether it was, overaged children or people who have been divorced or separated from employment. We found so many individuals that were not qualified to be covered. And we were able, just from doing the audit, to save a couple $1 million.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, what was really another thing that really struck me in the report was that, you recognized, and kind of my heart was palpitating, you recognized that to bring back city government, you needed to bring its finance into structural balance. But you did it without compromising the core quality of life and public safety services. So that's a challenge, right? To achieve budgetary solvency in the financial statements, but also, the value that people have when they choose to live and work and visit Baltimore. I read in there that you had three guiding principles for reform. That was tax competitiveness, infrastructure investment, and addressing your long-term liabilities. What happened? What were some of the initiatives that you had to implement to achieve some of those core principles for reform?
Well, in Baltimore City, we're an independent city, so we're not a part of the county. And if for generations, we have been, our tax burden on our citizens, our residents, is the largest in the state. And that makes us it puts us at a disadvantage when you're trying to attract people to your city. Now, do we have, are we also the home of significant institutions in the state? Historical, cultural, medical, educational, yes, we are. But when people are making a choice on where to live, the tax burden is something that is people consider. So I wanted to put together a plan to help us reduce our property, a responsible plan to reduce our property tax year over year, to give people a sense of predictability that, yes, we are, we recognize, the city recognizes that we need to lower our property taxes. And these are the things that we're going to do, the things that we're going to put in place to allow us to do more with less, to be more effective and more efficient, to be able to afford this property tax reduction, so we can keep people in Baltimore, stop the flight, and also attract people to live in Baltimore. So that was one of the things that we did.
Yeah, I noticed a number of these reforms, including the pension reform and the wellness programs we talked about. Right sizing must have been a pretty difficult decision. What departments were affected when you looked at the staffing of for your city?
Yeah, so the only way this works is if everyone was effective, and the only way this works is having a workforce that's committed to the city. Because as I mentioned, when I became mayor, we had a very significant budget deficit, and we had to do everything from hiring freezes, supply freezes, furloughs. I mean, it was very tough, and these were not these weren't, these were tough decisions that had consequences for people in their homes. And I did not take that for granted. That's why I wanted to work so hard to right size, to set our finances on the right course so we would never have to be here again. So, there were cuts across the board, but before we started doing the cuts, we very much focused on what are the things that matter to the people that we serve. We're calling them core services, our constituents calling them core services. How much, what are the things that our residents value the most? And then, you can start to make decisions about what we can live without. But it's, you start with your core values as a community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got a question in about where people can get a link to the 10-year plan, and it's in the chat box, audience, and we'll also provide that link at the end of this webinar. You can also just Google Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake name, and you'll find all kinds of references to her 10-year plan in Wikipedia, the source for all knowledge. But you kind of touched on this before, Mayor, and just like to maybe expound on it a little bit more, that when we're developing initiatives, especially initiatives like that user fees for stormwater, oh my goodness, that can be pretty controversial, or when it's hard to, the question I get often is, if you're going to put together a plan, how implementable are the new initiatives? And so when you were developing your scenarios, your options, what new initiatives you were considering, did you take into consideration whether or not they were politically feasible, whether or not they were implementable? And
you have to take into account the feasibility, but feasibility is not static. You have some influence on whether or not something is feasible. My finance and budget team really worked hard to improve the transparency around the budget process. There was so much misinformation about the budget process. And I often felt during the budget that some people, elected officials, as well as community leaders, community members, would feel like, the reason why a program was cut was because, there was no interest in funding it. And if we would only just go down to the basement of City Hall to our money tree, we would have enough money for everything,
Right.
But we started a very interesting process of bringing the budget to the community. We would have workshops in the community. Very exciting. Like, I don't know how bored you would have to be to want to spend the afternoon with our budget team, but we did it. We went out and we focused on community associations, people who were already civically engaged, and we said, listen, we want you to sit in the mayor's seat, look at the numbers, and you tell us what you would do with the budget. We had a $2.4 billion operations budget, many of the people who are on this webinar understand out of that 2.4, like what's really movable. A lot of these are salaries and other employment expenses. So, what to do with the pot that's left over. And I was a politics major in undergraduate school, and I grew up in politics. So, for me, this was the dream, just to see people sitting there listening to, the different the departments talk about, what's going on in Department of Public Works, or what's going on in Recreation and Parks, and why these things were important. And then to watch people, with their calculators sitting at the table trying to figure out, what they would do. And the more education we did around the budget, the easier these conversations were to have, because people understood the decisions that were being made at City Hall.
Yeah. Did you use a budget simulation tool for your citizens?
I feel like we did at some point, but when we first started, it was really just, handing out papers and,
yeah,
these are the numbers that you have to play with. It was pretty rudimentary when we first started.
We got a couple questions come in already, Mayor. One of the questions is, did the work of remedying the city's finances result in intentional elimination or reduction of silos within the organization? In other words, did you have to, intentionally eliminate staff?
Staff or silos?
Staff and silos.
So the financial plan, the reduction of the size of city government happened sort of on a parallel to the financial plan, and that was really motivated or informed by the significant budget deficit that we had coming out of the the economic downturn of, what was it, 2007, 08, 09. Yeah, so that was the 2008. Thank you. So we had to think more critically about the size of government then, right? So I wouldn't say it was the reduction in the staff was the size of government was directly as a result of the financial plan. I mean, we ended up at the same decision, one because of the economic pressures, the other because of our, the information around our budget. But yes, there was a reduction in the size of city government. With respect to silos, I attempted to reduce the silos in city government through outcome budgeting, which is but that's the topic for another webinar.
Okay.
Change from zero-based budgeting to budgeting for outcomes, and that's what I talked earlier about. Really, what priorities our community had, and budgeting around those core values and priorities. And that's what that was my attempt to break down the silos, not necessarily the financial plan.
Yeah, the follow-up to that question was cross-training and broadening job scope. Was that part of your strategy to create a flexible workforce?
I'm sure. I'm not. I feel like it was it had to be a part of it at some point, but it wasn't top of mind for me during the time. Okay.
Yep. Great. So let's move on to what were the rewards?
I will also say about the changing the scope. We did spend a lot of time trying to look for innovation from our workforce. So talking to the people who are responsible for doing the work about how the city could do the work better based on their experience.
Okay, so rewards, you got the plan, you started implementing them, you had visions of rewards, you started to see rewards, and now today you're looking back and say, here's how my plan worked. Tell us. Did your plan work?
In very significant ways, it did. I mean, my promise to myself was to leave the city in a better fiscal condition than I found it. And when I retired from public service, the city had the highest bond rating it had in over 40 years.
Wow.
We eliminated more than half of the structural budget deficit. At the time when I was mayor, I think we had done the most comprehensive pension and healthcare reform of any of my peers in city government. We worked really, really hard to deal with our infrastructure spending, particularly working with the Obama administration and EPA on more, I guess, to have more input in our infrastructure planning. Baltimore was under a consent decree, and I worked with mayors from across the country to really lobby the EPA for more autonomy with how we met the requirements of the consent decree with our infrastructure investment. And I also, we were able to reduce the property tax and also deal with blight in our city. I created an initiative called Vacancy to Value, which is still in effect today, which is a multi-pronged strategy to deal with vacant lots, vacant housing. And we received awards from not just national, but international recognition for that.
Vacancy to value, tell us more about how did that work?
So vacancy to value was, again, when I became mayor, one of the things that I promised myself was that, you know, we had these issues that have been around forever. You know, I was not interested in kicking the can down the road. I felt like if I was going to, if my time in office is going to matter, I was not going to pass these problems on, as many as I could, right? Did not want to pass them on to the next administration. And blighted and vacant homes in Baltimore has been a significant issue. The previous administrations had tried some innovation to try to deal with the problem, yet it persisted. And there wasn't a comprehensive plan for moving forward. So I went to my housing commissioner and I said, listen, you know, I know that we can do better. You know, there was some people in city government that wanted us to create a land bank. There were some people that, you know, there were lots of different competing policies. But, you know, I said, you know what the issues are. I want you to hire who you need to hire, fire who you need to fire, because housing, I'm sure in everyone's, you know, municipality, you know, there are places where hiring has been a challenge. And for us, the housing department has been a place where, you know, if you had a cousin or an uncle or a brother, you know, so many people were hired there that in the housing department at the time that probably had talents that were best suited in other places. So I said, you know, do what you need to do, but I want us to be able to tackle this in a strategic, in a very comprehensive way. And we created amazing incentives for home buying in Baltimore. We worked with our major employers to layer incentives. So, you know, we would encourage the biggest employers, the hospitals and universities. We had University of Maryland partnered with us, Johns Hopkins partnered with us, a lot of employers partnered with us, and they would give home buying incentives, and then we would layer on the city's incentives. But beyond that carrot, we also had a stick. And in some areas where there were marketable houses, and you know, there were marketable houses in stable or vulnerable areas, we wanted to shore up those neighborhoods by getting rid of absentee landlords or investors who really were, you know, had no interest in keeping up the property. So we raised the cost of neglect. So, if you wanted to keep a home in Baltimore and do nothing with it, the price went up. And for that reason, people who had been holding on to property and not doing anything, either, we pushed them to either sell it or to get it in livable condition and put people in it. And that was one of the things that we did. There are lots of different things that went into this program, but it was, I was proud because it looked to all of the things, including the red tape of city government to sell the vacant property that we owned, to do a comprehensive fix.
Well, thank you, Mayor. We're getting to the phase where I want to move this webinar into talking about the process that you used. And so, like in summary, it's kind of a basic methodology with technology. The first thing is what is a long-term financial plan? Why do a long-term financial plan? How does it fit in with your other planning process, and what are the phases? So I'm just going to summarize that. And this is kind of your turn now to ask me questions as I move through talking about the process that you and your leadership team and your consulting firm used, as well as just recommended by Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA. So I just want to highlight, I'm not going to read these slides to you. I just want to say that a forecast, a long-term financial forecast, is not a plan. A forecast is just a tool. It's to be used in the long-term financial planning process. It involves developing scenarios, or like Mayor Rawlings-Blake did, was taking options and analyzing them and then layering them into the forecast in order to generate a plan that's implementable. So it identifies the future challenges and opportunities, but it's the strategies that make the planning process so important. But you need a long-term forecasting tool as well. And technology helps us provide that by forecasting our pension, our long-term liabilities, our retiree medical care liabilities, forecasting our labor costs. GFOA recommends that we go into great pains and detail to look at all of the elements of our labor costs, not just inflate them by 3%, but by going into all the details so we can see the true impacts of pensions, medical retiree, and other types of labor costs. The second part is why do we do this? And I think the mayor laid out really well that she identified, she provided and communicated solutions to financial challenges. That's what a long-term plan process will do. And then the first year of your long-term financial plan usually becomes the first year of your annual budget. But it doesn't stop there. As we've talked about in many previous webinars, is that the long-term financial planning process is not a one-time event. It's a continuous process. Almost every policy decision that happens during the annual budget year, every month budget to actual report should be extrapolated to year end. And then that new year end becomes the new base year and yet another 10-year financial plan that's recalibrated. As you're continually recalibrating your long-term financial forecast, you're able to see, is my long-term financial plan implementable? So that's critical, that not only linking the annual budgets, but then reporting back on the annual budgets to whether it's accomplishing the goals and objectives of your long-term financial plan. It helps you, as the mayor pointed out earlier, no one anticipated COVID. No one can anticipate what the next black swan event will be, but we can prepare for those events today. And as they start to occur, we had early warning signs of COVID. We should have been dusting off our scenario plans in February of last year, rather than wait until June when the full economic impact of COVID hit. So long-term financial planning helps, prepare for financial shocks. It kind of insulates your constituents from unexpected tax or fee increases or severe drops in service levels. So, the community trust, the mayor talked about so much how important it was, the communications part. Communications in long-term financial planning is essential. You have to get that word out, and along the way, it improves the biggest deficit in government is the deficit in public trust, and anything we can do to address that public trust and improve that public trust is so important. So there's process and phases. These come from the GFOA long-term financial planning and forecasting workbook. There's 4 major phases in long-term financial planning: your mobilization, your analysis, your decision, and your execution. We saw all of that. Mayor talked about all of those phases, and that's in that 10-year plan. I encourage you to read that. We need to prepare in advance. So when I was going through long-term financial planning in the cities that I worked at, I would detail all of the planning process and then have it approved and bought into by my political and executive leadership. In other words, you can't start a planning process if you don't have leadership behind it. And with that incurs aligning resources. What technology do we need? Who's going to be involved? What kind of meetings are we going to have? Put together a Gantt flowchart of events that are going to be occurring to actually effectuate the long-term financial planning process. And then we move into the analysis. This is where we gather information, we project our trends, we look at our balances, dust off your reserve fund policies, and start to revision those through the lens of a very, very informational GFOA best practice, where you look at your reserves through a risk basis rather than, just 10% of reserves, that should be enough, or 5% of reserves. But calculate your reserves on what risks you're facing, what revenue volatility risks you're facing, what significant catastrophic loss risks are you failing, what kind of infrastructure risks are you facing. Your tax competitiveness, your long-term liabilities, all those risks. When you put that in, it'll tell you and help you calculate the amount of reserves that you should have in balance. And not only how much reserves you should have, but when to use those reserves and when to build those reserves. So, and then that winds up in a decision phase, is a collaborative, consensual decision-making phases, again, that uses tools. You could use, budget simulation tools, long-term financial planning tools that you draft financial strategies, you test those financial strategies. Are they implementable? Will they work? You build consensus around them, and then you adopt them. And once you adopt the long-term strategies, that's where the process continues with linking them, monitoring to them, and then reporting back on a regular basis. I always made it a practice that anytime a city council adopted a policy, I would report back on the impacts of that policy on a regular basis, so that they not only could see that their policy worked or that their policy needed to be tweaked, but it also reaffirmed that public trust. They say, here's what we did, and here's why we said we were going to do it. And now here's the outcome from what we did and what we said. And the community then trusts the politicians, more, and helps them build a stronger economy, a stronger constituent base, and a stronger local government. And finally, you got your execution phase, putting those policies into place, monitoring and updating your long-term financial plan. So, Mayor, it takes leadership. I love this quote that you made, that Baltimore is on the cusp of a proud renewal. We can change to grow. There's that positiveness that you had that started at the beginning, where you recognized the fiscal challenges. You faced those fiscal challenges. You addressed the challenges, and then you put together a plan to implement them. That was leadership. It was executive and political leadership. So what advice can you give our listeners today to move forward with bold plans for their local government?
I would say, first, start with the belief that it can happen. We did it in Baltimore. Baltimore is not magic. We had all of the challenges that you can imagine. We had many detractors, elected civic leaders, community members, and we had many supporters. We had a lot of obstacles, But if you are clear about where you're trying to go and why, I think it's easier to neutralize your detractors. And again, this is not, I'm not looking at any of the situations that people face today with rose-colored glasses. I know it's tough, but I also think that, the more that you confront the people who you need as stakeholders with the reality, educating people about what your jurisdiction, your municipality is really facing, the harder it will be for them to push back against your responsible moves to right size or your government and to put your budget on the right path.
Wow, what great advice. Thank you so much. We have a resource page here. I encourage everyone to look to the City of Baltimore 10-year fiscal forecast, and then the actual plan, Change to Grow, a 10-year plan. And then read the GFOA best practices. That's one of our best resources for where we can go. And we have GovInvest is a company that was born in helping governments prepare today for tomorrow's realities. GovInvest started by saying, we need to really understand those long-term liabilities, our pension and our OPEB, retiree medical care costs, and their models. Actually, I was one of their first customers, and it inspired me to adopt a major pension reform effort that is called the Section 115 Pension Pre-Funding Trust. And it's catching on across the United States as a financial best practice. Our customers told us, you're forecasting 75% of, a major percent of our labor costs. Why don't you forecast labor costs? And so they developed a tool that did that. And now we have developed a long-term financial forecasting tool that will help you in the long-term financial planning process. So please reach out. This is the time for questions. We got a chat. Oh, somebody wrote in another resource related to Baltimore's transformation is the book by Andrew Klein, City on the Line. So we encourage you to look to that book, and you'll see some I know Andrew, and I've read his book. He's filled with anecdotes. That's what I loved about it, was how this decision directly affected a particular citizen. So, thank you for responding to that. Someone else put into the chat box, I encourage all the participants to look at, here's where the link is to the best practices guide. And there's also a link in the chat box on more about Andrew Klein's book. All right, other questions that may came in from our audience. Kristen, have you noticed any other questions in the Q&A or the chat?
We've been addressing them as we've moved through the presentation, so there's none waiting at this time, but now's a great time to ask the mayor or Charlie any questions you have that are outstanding. Okay. Please use the chat box.
So Mayor, while we're waiting, I have a question for you. What's next in Mayor Rawlings-Blake political career?
Political career? After 21 years of elected office, I'm comfortably in retirement for my political career. I appreciate being able to give advice to people who are seeking political office, strategic advice, encouragement, a shoulder to cry on. but as far as, me politically, I love public service, but I also appreciate being on the other side of it.
Okay, so
Charlie, now I'm a part of the retiree benefit. Retirees, I'm one of the beneficiaries of my work to cut.
Oh, okay.
Reduce retiree health benefits.
Oh, Mayor, while we were talking about your political career, we did get a question come in the chat. It's is your financial plan, do you know if it's still being updated regularly by subsequent mayors?
I do not know if it's still being updated by the mayors, but a lot of the people that were in my administration are still a part of at least on the budget side. Andrew, who was part of my administration, has Andrew Klein, who was mentioned as he has moved on, but a lot of the people are still there. And the current mayor is definitely focused on making sure that he does the same as I did, leaving the city in a better condition, which is, it's a noble goal. And if you really are willing to do that work, again, just like we started, unless you're willing to face it, you can't address it. And he understands our challenges.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, and it seems like, oh, we just got another audience question. Oh, what's one change? So this is another question for you, Mayor, and maybe I'll pop in at the end of it. What's one change any local government, big or small, can they make to begin making their financials more sustainable and resilient?
One change. I would say one change. I feel like I'm cheating when I say two. I think right. So I would say you have to do a baseline analysis.
Yep.
If you don't know what you're dealing with, you don't know. There's no way to fix a problem that hasn't been diagnosed. You really have to have a full diagnosis. So I'll just say that is. I'll stop there and say that's one thing that you can do, because in order to tackle these issues, you have to be able to speak with authority about the health of your city's finances. Yeah,
I think the restoring the public trust in government is so important. Many people, they'll put up a transparency site and say, oh, I met my transparency obligation, but they never really work the site or use the site, effectuate the site so that it restores public trust. So, and once you start on this road of transparency, that leads you to accountability. And what better way to be accountable than to start planning for today for tomorrow's realities? Developing that long-term financial plan. And remember, long-term financial planning begins, just like the mayor talked, like we began our webinar, of what are the fiscal challenges, what are we facing, identifying them. And then once we've identified them, as James Baldwin said, we need to face those challenges. So I think it begins with leadership, and it begins with a mindset of we're going to make the world a better place because we were in it. So. All right, that concludes our webinar. Thank you all, audience, for being on the webinar today. For more information, you can always reach out to Kristen at GovInvest.com or me, Charlie at GovInvest.com. And even if you want to call me, you have my phone number here. So it's my cell phone, and I do answer it. It's right here next to me, unless I'm doing a webinar. There's a call coming in. Who's calling me from this webinar? Thank you so much. And that concludes our webinar. Goodbye.